Thanks for tuning in to Crazy Mango Stories. Give a thumbs up, subscribe, and hit the bell for more betrayal stories. Really? With him? My voice was barely a whisper, yet the words struck her like a sharp slap. I tossed the photographs onto the table, each one landing with an unforgiving finality. Her face went pale, her eyes darting desperately between me and the damning images. She started to speak, to explain or apologize, but I silenced her with a single raised hand, and her mouth closed in stunned compliance. "I trusted you," I continued, my voice steady but hollow. I could hear the disbelief dripping from each word, each syllable weighing down the room's air like a dense fog. "And you threw it all away. For him." The bitterness in my words hung heavy between us, echoing in the silent spaces of our history, in every memory we had crafted together over years. The reality of it, the surreal, sick truth, settled in, thick and irrevocable. Her eyes were wide, shimmering with fear and shock, but I couldn't find any sympathy left. The woman I had loved was no longer here. In her place stood someone who had betrayed me in the most fundamental way. I turned, hearing her gasp. A soft, broken sound, but it did nothing to ease the coldness that was spreading through me. That night, I lay awake, replaying every look, every slight laugh shared between them, every detail that now took on a poisonous meaning. My mind churned as memories realigned, reshaping themselves to reveal the truth hidden in plain sight. All her late nights, her sudden new wardrobe, her excuses. The walls I'd built around us, fortified by years of trust, now crumbled to dust. By morning, I knew what I had to do. When I walked into the office the next day, I could feel the plan taking shape with each step, my resolve hardening with every echo of her betrayal. Her lover, now my adversary, strutted through the office with the same smug confidence that had once made me admire him. But today, it was a different kind of admiration I held, one that saw not his charm, but his arrogance, his blindness to the reckoning headed his way. I spent that morning quietly gathering everything I needed, a quiet fury smoldering under my professional composure. Every piece of information, every transaction he thought hidden, every backdoor deal he'd thought secure. He'd believed himself untouchable, confident that he was smarter, quicker than anyone who might uncover his tracks. By noon, the foundation of his career was already beginning to crack, his achievements unraveling in silence, as I laid out each carefully hidden misdeed in a devastating sequence. His network of colleagues and connections, those who once sang his praises, were beginning to realize the truth I'd set in motion. About the lies, the deception, the deceit, masked under a veneer of professional success. As the day wore on, his confidence started to slip. He was fidgeting, glancing over his shoulder, making quick, uneasy phone calls. I watched as he started to understand that the life he had built, his victories, his friendships, the entire illusion of his career, was shattering. By the time he appeared at my office door, face pale, his self-assured mask long discarded, the once commanding presence had crumbled into a desperate, hollow man. He begged, his voice breaking, pleading for a chance to explain, to make things right. I met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw nothing but ice in my eyes. "Now," I said, my voice a calm whisper laced with steel, "you'll know what betrayal really costs." The office was buzzing with its usual activity, the hum of voices blending with the muted sounds of phones ringing and printers churning. But today, for me, everything had changed. The sense of betrayal sharpened my focus, fueling a sense of purpose that pulsed through me with every step. I could feel the power in it, a newfound clarity that washed away any remaining shock and replaced it with cold, calculated resolve. My target sat across the office, oblivious to the avalanche about to crash down on him. He was talking, laughing, his gestures broad and confident as he discussed figures, projections. None of it mattered anymore. Today, his carefully crafted world of numbers and achievements would be unraveled piece by piece, and I would be the one to pull every single thread. I retreated into my office and closed the door, setting my files and coffee cup aside. My fingers glided over my laptop as I pulled up the financial records I had meticulously gathered over the last few hours. A career of reading between the lines in contracts and financial documents had trained my eye for detail, for patterns, and for the inconsistencies that often went unnoticed. Only today, I wasn't looking to save the company from an external threat. I was the threat, aiming right at its heart. It didn't take long to find what I needed. His records, hidden under layers of dummy accounts and offshore entities, were messy but not invisible. Greed had made him reckless, and he'd left a trail of fraudulent transactions thinly veiled as business expenses and consulting fees. He'd been siphoning money out of our ventures for months, even years, padding his pockets under the guise of partnerships that never materialized, investments that had no returns. An ironic smile tugged at the corner of my mouth as I documented every misstep, each instance of embezzlement. His web of deception was intricate, but built on arrogance, leaving traces of every dollar he thought was well hidden. I pieced the transactions together, creating a narrative that would not only reveal his theft, but make it impossible for him to deny. By mid-morning, I had amassed enough to build an airtight case. Yet I knew I had to proceed cautiously. There was still something personal I needed to settle, something that went beyond the corporate scandal. I needed to watch him crack. That, I thought, would be the most satisfying moment, when he realized just how thoroughly he'd been caught. I leaned back, folding my hands and staring at the computer screen, the damning evidence neatly cataloged before me. It was time to take the next step, to set in motion the downfall he'd never seen coming. Casually, I made my way to the department heads, those who'd worked under his leadership for years, convincing them of his supposed brilliance, his so-called expertise. I started small, planting questions. Have you noticed these discrepancies? Did he mention anything about the offshore accounts? The seeds of doubt took root quickly, sprouting in the form of worried glances and hurried whispers. In just a few conversations, I could feel the shift in the atmosphere, the beginning of the collapse. Around noon, he stepped into the break room. His usual swagger seemed forced, as if he sensed something was amiss. But he had no idea that I was behind it. We exchanged a nod, and as he passed by, I caught a flash of something in his expression. A brief shadow of worry. I kept my face impassive, letting him interpret it however he wanted. He knew nothing yet, but that look on his face told me his instincts had begun to alert him. Then it was time for phase 2. I contacted the board members, those he'd tried so hard to impress. This part would need delicacy, precision. After all, I didn't want it to appear vengeful, so I laid it out in professional terms as if it were just another business matter to be resolved. "I thought you'd want to know," I said over the phone to the head of the audit committee, my voice calm, laced with just the right touch of concern. There are irregularities in the financials he managed, especially with the most recent contracts. I'd like to bring in an external audit team. There was a silence on the other end, and then a terse acknowledgement. I knew that from this point forward, they'd be watching him closely, analyzing his every move. His world was shrinking by the minute. That afternoon, he began to unravel. I caught glimpses of him darting from one office to the next, his smile growing thin, his hand running nervously through his hair. He disappeared for almost an hour, likely calling his contacts, scrambling to cover tracks he knew were exposed. But it was too late. By now, the whispers had become a low rumble, spreading like wildfire through the office. He'd tried so hard to project an image of infallibility, and it was slipping. By the time I returned to my desk, there was an email waiting for me from the HR director, Subject line, concerns regarding financial irregularities. My plan was working even faster than I'd anticipated. I replied with a simple, "Thank you for alerting me. I'll handle it discreetly," knowing well that by tomorrow the situation would be anything but discreet. Toward the end of the day, he came to my office. He was trying to act casual, but his movements were jerky, his eyes shifting nervously around the room. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" he asked, his voice just a touch too loud, too strained. He closed the door behind him, but he didn't sit. I met his gaze, keeping my expression blank, and waited. He shifted, uncomfortably, running a hand over his mouth. I noticed some of the team seemed, distracted. Have you heard anything about issues with the financials?" I leaned back in my chair, allowing a long pause to stretch between us. "I can't say I have," I replied coolly. "But if you're concerned, maybe it's time to get an audit going, don't you think?" The words hung in the air, and I could see the color draining from his face. You can't get back to the future and stop having that thought. You can't start a new present sentence." I studied him, the way his hands clenched tightly together, the subtle sheen of sweat on his forehead. It was almost pathetic how quickly his confidence had dissolved. Here was a man who had gambled everything, his career, his reputation, his honor, and now he stood before me with nothing but an empty defense. He'd thought he'd won, that he could take whatever he wanted, but now he was a man on the verge of ruin, and he knew it. "Right," he muttered, backing toward the door. "I'll look into that audit." When he left, I sat back, watching his shadow retreat down the hall, knowing that by tomorrow he'd be facing the consequences of every choice he'd ever made. By the following morning, the office was buzzing with tension. My adversary's usual bravado had crumbled to barely a shadow, his face pale, his eyes scanning the room as if searching for an exit no one could see. The whispers, the shifting glances among employees, it was all closing in on him, and for the first time I could see fear creeping into his gaze. It wasn't just the impending audit that unsettled him. By now, news of the investigation had leaked to key figures across the company. The board members were aware that an inquiry had begun, but not of its precise target. His every move, every conversation, was now watched with quiet suspicion, each interaction charged with the underlying question: what has he done? I took my time that morning, arriving later than usual, my demeanor composed and casual. As I walked through the office, I made subtle eye contact with those who had unknowingly become my allies. The whispers that had once been my own, now passing among them, feeding their curiosity. My enemy saw me as I entered the building, and in that moment, I could sense his desperation. He knew I had something to do with it, but he didn't know how much I knew, or how much power I held over him now. "Good morning," he greeted me, forcing a smile. He was attempting nonchalance, but his words came out rushed, his handshake too firm, too eager. I returned the greeting, nodding politely but saying nothing, letting the silence stretch just long enough for him to sense the hidden contempt in my gaze. As the morning wore on, I stayed in my office, calling for files, asking our financial team for records and reports, under the guise of standard compliance checks. It was a phrase that seemed innocent enough, but carried an unmistakable undertone. Something was very, very wrong. Each request landed like a blow, and I knew he could feel it, each question bringing him closer to the edge. Around midday, I heard from our IT manager that the audit team would arrive by week's end, much earlier than anticipated. I didn't hide the news. I wanted him to feel the pressure, the inevitable approach of his downfall. Word of the audit spread through the office in whispers, escalating the tension and fueling the silent suspicions. The staff's quiet conversations grew louder, the side glances more frequent as everyone began to connect the dots. By early afternoon, he was a man unraveling. In the glass reflection of the conference room, I watched as he paced, his phone clutched tightly in his hand, his expression dark with worry. He was making calls to his contacts, his allies, each attempt at damage control sounding increasingly desperate. He would need more than contacts to save him now, though. He was fighting a battle already lost, and I was watching the slow realization seep into him with every passing hour. Around 3 p.m., he came to my office again, barely knocking before letting himself in. He didn't bother with the usual pleasantries this time. His face was drawn, his composure fraying at the edges. "We need to talk," he said, voice hoarse. He attempted a smile, but the effect was hollow, the confidence that once seemed unshakable, now a distant memory. I motioned for him to sit, keeping my expression neutral as he settled into the chair opposite mine. "Sure," I said, leaning back slightly. "What's on your mind?" He hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the desk. "Listen, I feel like there's something happening here. I know there's talk of an audit, and I just want to make sure everything's on the up and up." I arched an eyebrow, feigning mild surprise. "On up and up? Well, I certainly hope so. After all, we all have our responsibilities to the company. Don't you agree?" He flinched, just barely, but enough for me to see the fear flicker in his eyes. I kept my tone steady, a hint of amusement coloring my voice. "You seem awfully concerned, though. Is there something you'd like to tell me?" No, it's not that," he stammered, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. "It's just, you know how people can be? Rumors, misunderstandings." "Of course." I nodded, keeping my gaze steady on his. "But in my experience, people tend to talk for a reason, especially when they have something to lose." I let the words hang in the air, watching as their weight settled onto him, pressing down on whatever last scraps of confidence he had left. "Clear the air. I know we've had our differences, but I'd hate for any of that to affect the company." I offered him a polite smile, one that I knew would haunt him long after he left my office. "We're both professionals," I replied smoothly. "Nothing personal, right?" He nodded, the words hollow as he murmured his agreement. And then he left, his footsteps retreating down the hall, each step a little quicker, a little more desperate than the last. The rest of the day passed quietly, the tension now so thick it felt almost suffocating. Every glance from his colleagues was a loaded question, every conversation laced with suspicion. I watched him shrink from view, slinking into the shadows of his own making, as I finalized my preparations for the final blow. When I left the office that evening, I lingered in the hall just long enough to catch a glimpse of him, hunched over his desk, the manila folders strewn before him, a testament to his frantic attempts to cover his tracks. He looked up, and for the briefest moment, our eyes met. There was a plea in his gaze, a wordless desperation that begged for mercy, for understanding. But I felt nothing. Whatever pity I might have had for him was long gone, replaced by the cold satisfaction of a plan nearing completion. Outside, the night was settling over the city, casting long shadows that stretched across the office building, deepening the darkness around it. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling the weight of betrayal lift from my shoulders, replaced by the sense of justice I'd craved since that night I discovered the truth. Tomorrow, I thought, tomorrow he would be exposed to everyone. I climbed into my car, my hands steady on the wheel as I pulled away, a quiet sense of finality settling over me. I climbed into my car, my hands steady on the wheel, as every chance he'd ever made ever vanished. I couldn't change it. I couldn't ditch it. I couldn't undo 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 it. As I drove, the lights of the city glinting in my rearview mirror, a single thought surfaced, clear and unwavering. It was only a matter of time now, and by the end of it, I would be free. The next morning, I arrived early, the office floor eerily quiet, save for the hum of the lights overhead and the faint whir of computers booting up. It was the calm before the storm. Today, everything would change. The audit team had already set up in a conference room down the hall, documents and files laid out meticulously on the table, awaiting the day's interrogation. I sat at my desk, sipping my coffee slowly as I watched him arrive. He looked worn, his face etched with worry, his suit wrinkled, as though he hadn't slept at all. His eyes darted around the office, scanning each face for signs of suspicion, every glance from his colleagues fueling his paranoia. The confidence he once carried had vanished, replaced by an anxious, furtive tension. It was a satisfaction I couldn't quite describe, watching him unravel as he understood the inevitability of his downfall. Mid-morning, the audit committee called him in. He shot a quick glance in my direction, a silent plea flickering in his eyes, but I kept my face unreadable. He hesitated, then turned away and disappeared into the conference room. As the door closed behind him, I knew that every misdeed, every theft he'd tried to hide, would soon be laid bare. The minutes dragged as I waited, each tick of the clock echoing in the silence around me. I imagined him on the other side of that door, facing the board members, each question poking another hole in his carefully constructed narrative, each accusation pushing him closer to the truth. His answers would be vague, his excuses flimsy, but I knew he would try. He would try to charm his way out of it, convince them it was all just a misunderstanding, perhaps a clerical error, anything to buy himself time. But charm had no place in the face of evidence, and I'd left no room for doubt. At noon, the door opened and he emerged from the conference room, his face ashen. He looked around, disoriented, as though the familiar office had become a foreign place. His shoulders slumped, and he staggered back to his desk, sinking into his chair, as though he could hide from the shame that was about to swallow him whole. But there would be no respite, no retreat. The whispers had turned to murmurs, his colleagues' eyes now openly filled with curiosity and disdain. They knew something was wrong, that the man they had once respected was now under scrutiny, his authority disintegrating with every step he took. I watched as he began making frantic calls, his voice a tense whisper as he tried, in vain, to reach out to his allies. But I knew he would find no one willing to speak to him now. I knew he would get no reputation was toxic, his once valued opinions now tainted by the shadow of the audit. Around 3 p.m., a quiet ripple of motion caught my attention. I turned to see the HR director striding purposefully across the floor, her expression a mixture of sympathy and resolve. She made her way to his office, pausing at the door before knocking gently and stepping inside. I couldn't hear the words that passed between them, but I could imagine the conversation, the polite explanations, the procedure and policy, each phrase another blow to his crumbling confidence. He listened, his face a mask of barely restrained dread, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of his desk. She spoke calmly, her tone even, yet there was no mistaking the finality in her voice. When she left, he sat motionless, staring at the closed door. Slowly, as though in a daze, he stood and crossed the room, shutting the blinds to his office window, creating a thin barrier between himself and the eyes that now watched his every move. As the afternoon dragged on, I received a notification, a message from the board's legal team. It was brief, a single line confirming what I had been waiting for, immediate dismissal pending final review. I closed my laptop, taking a moment to savor the victory. I had anticipated this moment, planned for it, but the reality of it The undeniable completeness of his defeat was more satisfying than I had expected. The power that he had wielded so thoughtlessly, the position he'd used to betray me, was now nothing more than a fading memory. He was stripped of everything he valued, and all that remained was the knowledge of his betrayal and the price he would pay for it. At 5, he finally emerged from his office. His face was drained, his eyes hollow, as though the fight had left him entirely. He didn't look at anyone, didn't acknowledge the stares that followed him as he made his way down the hall. I stood by my desk, watching as he approached, knowing he would stop. And he did, pausing in front of me, his expression a mixture of shame and desperation. He looked at me, his eyes searching, but for what I didn't know. Sympathy? Forgiveness? Perhaps some assurance that he hadn't lost everything. But I gave him nothing. "What happened to us?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. I met his gaze, letting him see the steel in my eyes, the resolve that had fueled every decision I'd made. "You threw it away," I replied quietly. "You thought you could take what you wanted and walk away, that no one would ever know." A flicker of regret crossed his face, a fleeting moment of recognition as he realized, truly understood, the gravity of what he'd done. He opened his mouth to say something, but no words came. Instead, he lowered his head, the silence between us filled with everything that had been lost, every moment of trust he had destroyed. Without another word, he turned and walked away, his steps slow, as though each one brought him further from the life he had once known. He didn't look back, didn't acknowledge the eyes that followed him as he made his way out of the building for the last time. When the door closed behind him, a quiet sense of peace settled over me, a calm that came from knowing that justice, true justice, had finally been served. I had thought revenge would bring bitterness, a hollow victory that left me emptier than before, but as I stood there, watching the office return to its usual hum, I realized that I felt free. He had tried to take everything from me, to destroy all that I had built, but in the end, he had only undone himself. The board issued a formal statement the next day, a carefully worded memo that explained his departure as a result of irregularities and policy violations. The staff read it with a quiet understanding, each person nodding, murmuring as the news spread. And then, slowly, the world moved on, his presence fading into a memory, a cautionary tale whispered in the hallways. And for me, the silence he left behind was enough.